The sun set over Oseikrom, its golden rays casting a mesmerizing glow on King Opoku's palace. It was a fortress of wealth, with walls adorned in shimmering gold and gates that sparkled under the faintest light. Every corner of the palace spoke of opulence. Rubies embedded in the throne room pillars, gold leaf on the ceilings, and diamond-studded chandeliers that reflected light like tiny stars. King Opoku, the master of this wealth, sat proudly on his gilded throne, a smug smile playing on his lips. At 40 years old, King Opoku was a man of striking presence. His tall, broad frame commanded respect, but it was his sharp, piercing eyes that made men cower before him. Yet, beneath the facade of grandeur and power lay a dark truth. He was a tyrant. The sub-chiefs who once served him loyally now feared him, and the villagers who once sang his praises spoke his name only in hushed whispers. The king's riches came at a cost to the people of Oseikrom. Taxes were cruelly high, and those who could not pay were dragged to the palace courtyard, where public punishments served as grim reminders of his authority. Stories of his cruelty were whispered around evening fires. The farmer who lost his land for offering too little tribute, the widow whose only son was taken to work in the king's mines, never to return. But to King Opoku, the suffering of his people mattered little. A ruler must be feared, not loved, he often declared to his sub-chiefs, his voice laced with disdain. He ruled with an iron fist, believing that his wealth made him untouchable. This evening, as he feasted alone in the grand dining hall, a sub-chief named Tim entered the room. Tim, known for his boldness, approached the king with a deep bow. "Your Majesty, there is unrest among the villagers," he began cautiously. King Opoku leaned back in his chair, a sly smile forming. "Unrest? What foolishness do these peasants speak now?" "They whisper of unfair treatment, my king," Tim said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his fear. "Some even speak of resistance." The king laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the room. "Resistance? Against me? Let them try. I will crush them like ants beneath my feet." Yet, as Tim bowed and left the room, unease flickered in the king's heart. He dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. After all, who would dare challenge a man whose wealth and power rivaled the gods themselves? Unbeknownst to him, the whispers of rebellion were growing louder. By nightfall, a group of villagers gathered in a secluded corner of Oseikrom. Their faces were etched with determination, their voices low but resolute. Among them was a young woman named Adjoa, whose father had been one of the king's victims. "The time has come," Adjoa whispered, her voice steady. "We have suffered enough. The gold he hoards belongs to the people of Oseikrom, not to one man." "But how do we fight a man with so much power?" an elderly farmer asked. Adjoa's eyes burned with resolve. "We fight with unity. If we stand together, his wealth will mean nothing. Gold cannot shield him from the strength of a united people." As the meeting continued, shadows danced on the walls, and the sound of distant drums echoed faintly through the night. The villagers knew they were treading dangerous ground, but their hunger for justice outweighed their fear. Meanwhile, within the palace, King Opoku retired to his chambers, oblivious to the storm brewing outside. He glanced at the massive golden chest at the foot of his bed, its lid slightly ajar. Inside lay a fortune beyond imagination. Bars of gold, priceless gems, and ancient artifacts stolen from neighboring lands. It was his greatest pride, his ultimate weapon. He reached out and closed the chest with a loud thud, muttering to himself, "Let them whisper, let them plot. They will learn that King Opoku's wrath is swift and unforgiving." Yet, as he drifted to sleep, he could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. The shadows in his room seemed to stretch and shift, and the night air carried a sense of foreboding. Outside the palace, a single candle flickered in the window of the villagers' meeting place. It was the flame of rebellion, small but unwavering, ready to grow into an inferno that would consume the golden throne. Oseikrom awoke to the sound of the palace drummers, their deep rhythms marking the start of another day under King Opoku's rule. The villagers moved about with wary silence, their expressions grim. Though the sun shone brightly over the golden palace, its light did little to chase away the heavy clouds of despair that lingered over the village. In the market square, the signs of the king's tyranny were everywhere. Merchants sold their goods in whispers, afraid to attract the attention of the royal tax collectors. Children played half-heartedly, their laughter muted by the weight of their parents' struggles. Even the elders, who once sat in the shade of the baobab tree sharing stories, now spoke in hushed tones, their gazes darting toward the palace. Amid this gloom, Adjoa walked with purpose. She carried a basket of yams, her face calm but her mind racing. The meeting last night had ignited something in her, a spark of hope, a determination to fight back. She knew the villagers were scared, but she also knew that fear alone could not sustain the king's rule forever. As she passed the smithy, she noticed Kojo, the blacksmith, hammering away at a piece of metal. He was one of the few villagers who still showed signs of defiance. "Kojo," she called softly. He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Adjoa, what news do you bring?" "More are joining us," she said. "The farmers from the northern fields, the potters from the riverbank, they're ready. But we need your strength, Kojo. Will you stand with us?" Kojo's jaw tightened as he glanced toward the palace. "I have no love for the king, but his guards patrol these streets like vultures. If we fail—" "We won't fail," Adjoa interrupted, her voice firm. "We cannot afford to." Kojo hesitated, then nodded. "If you're leading, Adjoa, I'll follow. But we'll need more than courage. We'll need a plan." Adjoa nodded. "We meet again tonight. Bring whoever you can trust." As the day wore on, similar conversations unfolded in secret corners of the village. The fishermen whispered of rebellion as they mended their nets. The weavers exchanged knowing glances as they spun their cloth. Even some of the sub-chiefs, long oppressed by the king's arrogance, began to entertain thoughts of defiance. Meanwhile, in the palace, King Opoku sat in council with his sub-chiefs. The air in the throne room was tense, though the king seemed oblivious. He lounged on his golden throne, a goblet of palm wine in his hand, as the sub-chiefs presented their reports. "Your Majesty," one of them began hesitantly, "the villagers grow restless. They speak of unfair taxes and harsh punishments." King Opoku smirked. "Let them grumble. Grumbling is the pastime of the weak." Another sub-chief, Kwaku, cleared his throat. "But, my king, there have been gatherings. Small groups meeting in secret. It may be wise to—" "To what?" King Opoku snapped, his eyes narrowing. "To lower the taxes? To show mercy? Mercy is a weakness I cannot afford. If they wish to rise against me, let them try. They will learn that rebellion against the crown is a death sentence." The sub-chiefs exchanged uneasy glances. Kwaku opened his mouth to speak again, but thought better of it. He bowed low, his words swallowed by fear. That night, the villagers gathered once more, this time in greater numbers. The meeting was held in an abandoned hut on the edge of the forest, where the trees provided cover and the rustling leaves masked their voices. Adjoa stood at the center, her eyes scanning the crowd. Men and women of all ages had come, their faces lit with a mixture of fear and determination. "We all know why we're here," she began. "We cannot continue to live under King Opoku's rule. His gold has blinded him, but it does not make him invincible. We are many, and he is one." "But what can we do?" someone asked. "He has guards, weapons, and power. All we have are our hands." Adjoa raised a fist. "These hands built Oseikrom. These hands farm the fields, catch the fish, and weave the cloth. Without us, there is no kingdom. If we unite, we are stronger than gold, stronger than fear." The crowd murmured in agreement. Adjoa continued, her voice rising. "Tomorrow, we begin. Spread the word, but be careful. The king's spies are everywhere. Trust only those you know." As the meeting ended, Adjoa felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Kwaku, the sub-chief who had dared to challenge the king in council. "I heard your words," he said quietly. "You have courage, Adjoa, but courage alone won't win this fight. I can help you." Adjoa studied him carefully. Why would a sub-chief betray the king? "Because even gold cannot shield a man from his own greed," Kwaku replied. "The king's cruelty has made enemies of us all. Together, we can bring him down? Adjoa nodded slowly. Then we'll need a plan. A good one. Kwaku smiled faintly. Leave that to me. As the villagers dispersed into the night, the air was thick with tension. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, but whether they would bear fruit or wither under the king's wrath remained uncertain. In the shadows of the forest, a figure watched the villagers leave, their face hidden by the darkness. The rebellion was not as secret as Adjoa had hoped. The morning after the secret meeting, the village of Oseikrom stirred with an uneasy energy. The people moved about their daily tasks, but their glances lingered longer on the palace. Whispers spread like wildfire, of rebellion, of plans to overthrow the golden throne. Yet, as determined as the villagers were, so too was King Opoku's paranoia growing. In the Grand Palace, King Opoku summoned his royal guards to the throne room. The air was heavy with tension, the guards standing in rigid silence as the king paced before them. His golden robe shimmered with each step, but his face betrayed the storm brewing within him. There are whispers of rebellion, he said, his voice sharp and commanding. Villagers conspiring in the shadows, spreading lies and insolence. I will not tolerate it. The captain of the guard, a seasoned warrior named Badu, stepped forward. Your Majesty, we will increase patrols and interrogate anyone acting suspiciously. No one will defy you and live. Good, King Opoku replied, though his tone remained cold. He stopped pacing and turned to Badu, his piercing eyes narrowing. But be warned, this rebellion is not the work of ordinary peasants. Someone among my court is feeding their flames. Find the traitor, captain, or I will find them myself. While the king tightened his grip, the villagers prepared in secret. Adjoa, now the de facto leader of the rebellion, worked tirelessly to unite the people. Each night, they met in different locations, by the river, in abandoned huts, or deep in the forest, sharing plans and strategies. We must strike where it hurts most, Adjoa told them one evening. The king's gold is the source of his power. If we take it, we strip him of his strength. But how do we get inside the palace? Kojo asked. The gates are guarded day and night. Adjoa glanced at Kwaku, the sub-chief who had joined their cause. He stepped forward, his expression grim but determined. I've served in the palace for years, Kwaku said. I know its secrets, the hidden tunnels, the weak points in the defenses. With my knowledge and your courage, we can succeed. The villagers listened intently as Kwaku outlined the plan. The rebellion would take place during the king's weekly feast, when the palace guards were distracted by food and drink. A small group would infiltrate the palace through an old servant's tunnel, while the rest of the villagers created a diversion at the gates. It was a risky plan, but it was their best chance. As the day of the feast approached, tension in the village reached a breaking point. The king's guards roamed the streets in pairs, their eyes scanning for any sign of dissent. Fear gripped the villagers, but so too did determination. On the morning of the feast, Adjoa and her group gathered in the forest. The mood was somber, each person silently preparing for the task ahead. Kojo sharpened his tools, while others whispered prayers to their ancestors. Are you ready? Adjoa asked Kwaku, who stood apart from the group, staring toward the palace. He nodded, though his face betrayed a hint of unease. I've waited for this moment for years. It's time the king paid for his sins. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the group made their way toward the palace. They moved in silence, their steps light and deliberate. The air was thick with suspense, every rustling leaf and distant sound setting their nerves on edge. At the palace gates, the larger group of villagers began their diversion. They approached with torches and drums, their chants growing louder with each step. The guards rushed to confront them, leaving the tunnel entrance unguarded. Adjoa, Kwaku, and a handful of others slipped into the tunnel, their hearts pounding. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the air heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Keep moving, Adjoa whispered, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. They emerged inside the palace, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. The gold-lined walls seemed to glow faintly, a stark contrast to the darkness of the tunnel. This way, Kwaku said, leading them toward the treasury. But as they rounded a corner, they stopped abruptly. Ahead of them stood Badu, the captain of the guard, flanked by a dozen soldiers. You didn't think it would be that easy, did you? Badu sneered, drawing his sword. Adjoa's mind raced. How had they been discovered? Was there a traitor among them? She glanced at Kwaku, who avoided her gaze. "Run!" she shouted, drawing the attention of the guards as the group scattered. Chaos erupted in the palace as shouts and the clash of metal filled the air. Adjoa ducked into a side corridor, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of the betrayal. Had Kwaku led them into a trap? Or was there someone else pulling the strings? As she hid in the shadows, the sound of footsteps grew louder. The rebellion had begun, but the outcome was far from certain. The chaos within the palace swirled like a storm, the clanging of swords and the shouts of guards filling the once silent halls. Adjoa pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her breath ragged, as she listened to the noise outside. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling with the adrenaline of the failed mission. The guards were closing in, and she had no idea where Kwaku had gone. The path she had taken was a dead end. No exit, no escape. But then, she heard something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps, but not the hurried march of the guards. These were slower, deliberate. Someone was coming toward her. She didn't move, her mind racing as she tried to come up with a plan. The figure came into view, a tall man with a gleaming sword, his silhouette framed by the dim light of a torch. It was Badu, the captain of the guard. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the dark hallway. Adjoa held her breath, hoping he wouldn't see her, but it was too late. Badu's gaze landed directly on her, a sinister smile tugging at his lips. Well, Badu said, his voice low and mocking. The leader of the rebellion, hiding in the shadows. Did you think you could steal from King Opoku and get away with it? Adjoa didn't reply, her mind scrambling for a way out. Her heart was still racing, but she refused to show fear. She would not be captured. Not now, when the villagers were depending on her. Badu took a step forward. You think you can overthrow the king, do you? The villagers don't know what they're dealing with. They don't know how deeply the roots of this kingdom run. Adjoa's pulse quickened as she realized what he was implying. He wasn't just talking about the guards. He was talking about something deeper, something hidden in the dark corners of Oseikrom. Before she could process the thought, a loud crash echoed down the hall. Another group of guards had arrived, and Badu turned his attention momentarily. Adjoa saw her chance. In one swift motion, she darted down a narrow passage, her feet barely touching the ground. She ran, not knowing where the tunnel would lead, but trusting her instincts. She couldn't be caught now. As she raced through the labyrinth of halls, her mind reeled. Had Kwaku betrayed them? The doubt gnawed at her, but she had no time to dwell on it. She had to find her way out, and quickly. Outside, the village was erupting in chaos. The drums that had once sounded as a signal for rebellion now rang out as alarms. The diversion at the gates had failed. Guards flooded the streets, rounding up villagers with brutal efficiency. Kojo, who had been part of the distraction, found himself in the middle of the commotion, his fists clenched in frustration. He had seen the signal to retreat, but many of the villagers had been caught in the open. We can't fight them head-on, he muttered to himself. We need a plan. Suddenly, a voice called out from behind him. Kojo, this way. He turned to see Kwaku running toward him, his face grim and sweating. What's going on? Kojo demanded, his eyes narrowing. They knew we were coming, Kwaku said, his voice urgent. There's a traitor among us. I didn't know they'd be prepared. Kojo's mind raced. A traitor? Who? Kwaku shook his head. I don't know, but we need to regroup. We can't win this fight unless we get the others back together. Back inside the palace, the guards had begun to search every room, every corridor. Adjoa had no choice but to keep moving, dodging patrols as she desperately searched for an escape. Her mind was still fixated on Kwaku. What had happened? Had the rebellion been doomed from the start? She stumbled upon a small, forgotten door in the back of the palace, hidden behind a tapestry. Without thinking, she threw it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. She descended quickly, her breath sharp in her chest, as the sound of footsteps grew louder above her. The staircase opened into a forgotten chamber, one she recognized. It was the king's private vault, a room where he stored his most prized possessions. Gold, jewels, ancient relics. All of it was there, piled high in heaps. But the sight of the treasure no longer stirred her with the same awe it once had. All she could think of was how this wealth had caused the suffering of her people. The gold that had built the king's power had also built the chains that bound them. Adjoa didn't hesitate. She grabbed a handful of coins, stuffing them into her pockets. If the king's gold could fall into the hands of the people, it could change everything. But just as she turned to leave, a voice echoed in the darkness. "Leave it." Adjoa froze, her body going rigid with fear. The voice was low, familiar. She knew that voice. It was Kwaku. She whirled around to face him. "Kwaku, you." But before she could finish, Kwaku stepped forward, his eyes cold and distant. The flickering light from the torch cast strange shadows on his face. "Did you really think we could win?" he asked, his voice now tinged with bitterness. "That the people could rise against a king with such power?" Adjoa's heart sank as she realized the truth. Kwaku wasn't there to help her. He was the traitor. "Why?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Why betray us?" Kwaku's eyes narrowed. "Because loyalty to the crown is worth more than loyalty to peasants. The king promised me power, everything I could ever want." Adjoa took a step back, horror flooding her chest. "You were never one of us. You were always working for the king." He smiled coldly, stepping closer. "I always knew you were naive. But don't worry. The king will deal with you and the rebellion." Adjoa's heart pounded in her chest as she stood in the dim vault, facing Kwaku. The betrayal hit her like a sharp blow. The man she had trusted, the one who had seemed so committed to their cause, was no better than the king they were trying to overthrow. "Why did you join us, Kwaku?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You knew what the king was doing to the people. Why fight for him?" Kwaku's eyes glinted in the low light. "Because power is a rare gift, Adjoa. People like you, people who think only of the good of others, will always lose. I want to win, and I will do whatever it takes." Adjoa clenched her fists. Her dream of a better village, a better life for her people, felt shattered. But she couldn't afford to fall apart now. "If you think I'm going to let you stop me," she said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her, "you're mistaken." Kwaku stepped closer, his hand resting on the sword at his side. "You're a fool. The king will deal with you. All I have to do is take you back to him, and your rebellion will end." "Not if I stop you first," Adjoa retorted. In a flash, she darted toward a nearby chest filled with gold coins. Grabbing a handful, she hurled them at Kwaku. The coins scattered, clinking against his armor, and for a brief moment, his eyes were diverted. That was all she needed. With a swift movement, Adjoa rushed toward a hidden door at the far side of the vault. She didn't look back as she fled through the passageway, her breath coming in quick gasps. She could hear Kwaku's footsteps behind her, but she was faster. She reached the courtyard just as the first light of dawn broke over the village. The sound of battle still echoed in the distance, but the palace seemed to be in chaos. Her heart still ached from the betrayal, but there was no time to mourn. Adjoa knew she had to get back to the villagers. They needed to hear the truth about Kwaku and the king's lies. In the village square, the rebellion had taken a new turn. The villagers, though disheartened by their defeat at the palace, had rallied together. They were furious, not just at King Opoku, but at the treachery they had discovered among their own. Kwaku's betrayal had fueled their rage, and now they knew they had to act quickly. Kojo, with a small group of fighters, was already leading a second wave against the palace. "We may have lost the first round, but we still have the strength of our people," he declared. "We will not be defeated." Adjoa arrived at the square just as Kojo's words echoed through the crowd. She ran up to him, breathless and wild-eyed. "Kojo, it's Kwaku," she gasped. He was the traitor. He was working for the king all along. Kojo's face darkened. "I knew something was wrong. I should have seen it sooner. But now we know. We can't waste any more time." The villagers rallied. their faces set with grim determination. The king's gold might have given him power, but it also made him arrogant and vulnerable. It was time to end his reign. King Opoku sat in his royal chambers, his face drawn and pale. He had just received word that his gold had been taken from the vault. His heart raced as he realized that the rebellion was not just a threat. It was becoming a reality. The villagers had the courage to rise up, and worse, they now knew that he had used his wealth and power to manipulate everyone around him. "Find them," the king barked at his captain Badu, who stood at attention. "I want every last one of them brought to me. They will pay for this treason." But as Badu turned to leave, he hesitated, his face uncertain. "What is it, Captain?" King Opoku snapped. Badu lowered his head, his voice quiet but firm. "My king, I've been with you through every battle, every challenge. But this," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "this rebellion is different. The people are rising, and you've driven them to it. The gold won't save you this time." Opoku's face twisted in fury. "You dare question me?" "No," Badu said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "But I cannot support you in this." For a long moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension thick between them. Finally, Badu spoke again. "I've seen the suffering of the people. They won't back down, and neither will I." Without another word, Badu turned and walked away. Opoku stared after him, the walls of his world crumbling. By midday, the villagers had reached the gates of the palace. Adjoa, Kojo, and the others led the charge, their hearts fueled by the pain of years of oppression. King Opoku's reign was crumbling, and there was no turning back. As they stormed the palace, the guards scattered. Many of them, like Badu, had begun to question their loyalty. The palace, once a symbol of power and wealth, now stood as a hollow reminder of the king's cruelty. Adjoa made her way to the throne room, where King Opoku sat, his regal posture crumbling as he realized that no gold would save him now. He looked up as the villagers entered, his face a mix of fury and fear. "You dare to defy me?" King Opoku spat, rising from his throne. "I am the king. I have the wealth, the power." Adjoa stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with unyielding strength. "The people have taken what is rightfully theirs, King Opoku. Your wealth will not protect you now. Your time has come." With those words, the villagers surrounded the king. The golden throne, which had once been a symbol of his absolute power, now felt like a gilded cage. King Opoku looked around, his face twisting with desperation, but it was too late. The village had turned. The gold that had once held them in chains now belonged to them. The villagers, having endured years of suffering, would no longer bow to tyranny. And so, King Opoku's reign came to an end, not through the blade, but through the power of unity, rebellion, and the desire for justice. The people of Oseikrom had won. The gold was theirs, and with it, a new era began. The villagers, though angry and vengeful, decided not to execute King Opoku outright. Instead, they wanted him to feel the weight of his actions. He was stripped of his royal garments and forced to live among the commoners he had once oppressed. Without his gold or loyal guards, King Opoku became just another villager, working hard to earn his daily bread. The people ensured he toiled in the fields, the very same fields he had ignored while basking in his wealth. Over time, Opoku became a shadow of his former self. His once proud demeanor faded as he saw firsthand the suffering his greed had caused. The whispers of children and the glares of villagers were constant reminders of his fall from grace. As years passed, Opoku grew humble, his arrogance replaced by regret. He spent the rest of his life trying, in small ways, to make amends, helping rebuild the village with his hands. The people forgave him eventually, but they never allowed him to forget. Kwaku's betrayal earned him the villagers' wrath. When the truth of his treachery was revealed, the people of Oseikrom demanded justice. They believed his punishment should be more severe than Opoku's, as he had not only betrayed the rebellion but also sold out his own people for personal gain. The village council sentenced Kwaku to exile, banishing him from Oseikrom forever. Stripped of his dignity and cast out into the wilderness, Kwaku wandered from one village to another, but word of his betrayal always followed him. No one would trust him, and he found himself isolated, rejected wherever he went. Years later, Kwaku returned to Oseikrom in secret, hoping to beg for forgiveness. But he was caught and driven out once more, his face a symbol of deceit. He lived the rest of his days alone, consumed by regret for the choices he had made. The tale of King Opoku's fall and Kwaku's betrayal became a legend in Oseikrom, a warning to future leaders and opportunists about the dangers of greed, arrogance, and disloyalty. The people of Oseikrom, united and free, vowed never to let such tyranny rise again. Dear viewers, what lessons did you take away from this dramatic tales? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, give us a thumbs up, share it with friends, and hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest update. Thanks for watching and stay blessed.